Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Anyone who has driven through rural Minnesota in January knows exactly what I mean when I say the sky and the road become the same shade of white. That particular Monday, I was heading back to Duluth after visiting my mother in Bemidji, a 3-hour drive I had made dozens of times since finishing nursing school 6 years earlier. My graduating class from 2018 used to joke about how we scattered across the state like seeds in the wind, and I ended up at St. Luke's Hospital working night shifts in the ICU. The forecast had mentioned light flurries, nothing that would stop someone who grew up learning to drive on icy back roads before she could legally vote. I left my mother's house around 4 in the afternoon, figuring I would beat the worst of it. Maybe grab dinner at that little diner outside of McGregor before the final stretch home. The Subaru Outback had good tires, a full tank, and I had driven through worse conditions more times than I could count. Looking at the pale gray clouds gathering on the horizon, I remember thinking this would be just another uneventful winter drive. By 5:30, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The light flurries had transformed into something vicious, sheets of snow driving sideways across Highway 2 with a fury that made my windshield wipers completely useless. I was crawling along at maybe 20 miles per hour, both hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, my headlights barely cutting through the wall of white in front of me. The road had emptied out completely in the past half hour, which should have been my first warning to pull over and wait it out. But the next town was supposedly only 15 miles ahead, and I convinced myself I could make it, that stopping on the shoulder in this visibility was more dangerous than pushing forward. That kind of logic sounds reasonable, until you feel your back tires lose traction on a patch of black ice hidden beneath fresh powder. The Subaru spun once, maybe twice, and then I was sliding sideways toward the ditch at the edge of the road. The impact with the snowbank jolted my entire body forward, and then everything went still, except for the howling wind rocking the car like it wanted to flip it over completely. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing, doing that quick mental inventory you do after an accident to make sure everything still works. Neck, spine, arms, legs, fingers, toes. Everything moved the way it should. The airbags had not deployed, which told me the impact was not as bad as it felt, but when I tried to reverse out of the snowbank, the wheels just spun uselessly against the ice beneath them. I shifted into drive, then reverse again, rocking the car back and forth the way my father taught me when I was 16, but the Subaru was wedged in at an angle that gave me no traction whatsoever. The snow was piling up against the driver's side door so fast I could watch it rising inch by inch through the window. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and felt my chest tighten when I saw the screen. No signal, not even a single bar flickering in and out. This stretch of highway was notorious for dead zones, something I knew but had never worried about until this exact moment when it actually mattered. The temperature inside the car was already dropping, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in front of my face. I kept the engine running for the heat, watching the fuel gauge and calculating how long I could stay warm before I had to start rationing. The wind was screaming now, gusts that shook the entire vehicle and sent snow swirling past the windows in hypnotic spirals. I tried my phone again, holding it up toward the ceiling, then toward each window, searching desperately for a signal that simply was not there. My plan was to wait until another car passed, flag them down, get a tow, or at least a ride to somewhere with cell service. Except, no cars were passing. The road remained empty, swallowed by the storm, and every minute that ticked by made me feel more and more like I had slipped off the edge of the world into some frozen void where no one would ever find me. I told myself to stay calm, that this was Minnesota, that someone would come eventually, that people drove this highway all the time, even in bad weather. I just had to be patient and wait. Nearly 40 minutes passed before I saw headlights in my rearview mirror, 2 pale yellow beams cutting through the curtain of snow, like the eyes of some slow-moving animal. The relief that flooded through me was almost embarrassing. This overwhelming wave of gratitude toward a stranger I had not even seen yet. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and I could make out the shape of a pickup truck, one of those older models with the extended cab and rust creeping up along the wheel wells. It pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet behind my Subaru, hazard lights blinking orange through the white haze, and for a moment, nothing happened. I watched in my mirror as the driver's side door opened, and a figure climbed out, hunched against the wind, wearing a heavy canvas jacket the color of dried mud and a hunting cap with the ear flaps pulled down. He walked toward my car with this unhurried pace that struck me as strange given the conditions, like he was strolling through a parking lot on a sunny afternoon instead of trudging through a blizzard on a deserted highway. I rolled my window down about 2 inches, just enough to speak through, and the cold air that rushed in felt like needles against my face. He leaned down to the gap in the window, and I got my first real look at him. Mid-50s maybe, with a face that had clearly spent decades outdoors, deep creases around his eyes and a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once. His eyes were this washed-out blue, almost gray, and they moved across my face in a way that made me feel like I was being inventoried rather than looked at. He smiled, showing teeth that were slightly too small for his mouth, and said he had seen me slide off about a mile back, that he had turned around to come help. His voice was calm, friendly even, with that particular Minnesota accent that stretches vowels out flat like taffy. He said his name was Lyle, asked if I was hurt, asked if I had anyone coming. I told him I was fine, just stuck, that I had no cell signal, but I was sure someone else would come by soon. He nodded slowly at that, looking up and down the empty road, then back at me with those pale eyes. The wind was howling so loud I had to lean closer to the window gap to hear him when he said I should let him help me get out before the weather got worse. Before, he said, like this was not already the worst weather I had ever driven through in my life. I thanked him for stopping, but told him I would rather wait for a tow truck, that I had roadside assistance through my insurance, and someone would be along eventually. The words came out polite, measured, the way you talk to a patient's family member when you are trying to de-escalate without making things worse. Lyle straightened up and looked at my car for a long moment, then crouched back down to the window with that same small-toothed smile. He said there was no tow truck coming in this storm, that the county had already closed the highway about 10 miles east, that I was lucky he came along when he did. Something about the way he said lucky made my skin prickle beneath my coat. He reached for the door handle and pulled, gently at first, then with more force when he found it locked. His smile did not change, but his eyes did, something flickering behind them like a shadow passing across water. He asked me to unlock the door so he could help me out, said his truck had 4-wheel drive and chains on the tires, said he could take me somewhere safe and warm. I told him no thank you. I was fine, I would wait. My voice stayed steady, but my heart was beating so hard I could feel it pulsing in my throat. Lyle stood there for what felt like a full minute, just staring at me through that 2-inch gap in the window, the snow accumulating on his shoulders and the brim of his cap. Then he walked around to the back of my car, disappearing from view, and I twisted in my seat to try to see what he was doing through the rear window. The snow was too thick, the glass too fogged from my breath, and all I could make out was his dark shape moving near my back tire. I heard a sound, this sharp hissing noise that cut through the wind, and it took me a moment to understand what it was. He was letting the air out of my tire. I started honking the horn, long, desperate blasts that the storm swallowed almost immediately, and Lyle came back around to my window with something new in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of patient disappointment, like a parent dealing with a stubborn child. He wedged his boot against the bottom of my door, right in the gap where it met the frame, and leaned close to the window. His breath fogged the glass as he told me that I had no choice but to accept his help now, that I was not going anywhere on a flat tire in a blizzard, that I was being foolish, and he was trying to save my life. The hissing continued from somewhere behind him, and I realized he must have moved to the other rear tire before coming back to the window. I kept hitting the horn, pressing it over and over, the sound pathetic and muffled against the roar of the storm. Lyle did not even flinch, just stood there with his boot wedged against my door, watching me with those colorless eyes like he had all the time in the world. Then I saw something that made my heart seize up in my chest, a faint glow in the distance behind his truck. Barely visible through the whiteout, but definitely there. Another vehicle. Headlights moving toward us, slow but steady, and I realized this was my only chance to get someone's attention. I laid on the horn with everything I had, screaming at the same time even though I knew no one could hear me through the closed windows and the howling wind. Lyle turned his head to look at the approaching lights, and for just a second I thought he might give up, might walk back to his truck and drive away before anyone saw what he was doing. Instead, he did something that still wakes me up at night sometimes when the wind blows hard enough against my bedroom window. He moved fast, faster than I would have expected from a man his age, climbing onto the hood of my car with the agility of someone who had done this before. He was carrying something, a bundle he must have grabbed from his truck while he was behind my car, and he shook it out as he crouched on the hood like some massive bird of prey. It was a tarp, dark green canvas, the kind you use to cover firewood or wrap around things you want to hide. He spread it across my windshield with quick, practiced movements, tucking the edges down on either side so the wind would not rip it away, and suddenly I was in complete darkness. The weak gray light of the storm vanished entirely, replaced by this suffocating blackness that pressed against my eyes, like something solid. I could hear the other vehicle getting closer, the low rumble of its engine vibrating through the air, and I screamed and pounded on the windshield from the inside, trying to dislodge the tarp, trying to make any kind of commotion that might catch the driver's attention. But the tarp stayed in place, weighted down by the snow that was already accumulating on top of it, and I heard the other vehicle slow down, pause for a moment, and then keep going. The engine sound faded into the storm until there was nothing left but the wind and Lyle's boots shifting on the hood above me, patient and deliberate, waiting in the darkness he had created. Something clicked in my brain then, that survival instinct they say kicks in when you are truly cornered. I stopped screaming, stopped pounding, and forced myself to think. My purse was on the passenger seat, and inside it was a small canister of pepper spray my mother had given me years ago, one of those gifts you toss in your bag and forget about, until suddenly you need it more than you have ever needed anything. I found it by touch in the darkness, my fingers closing around the cold metal cylinder, and I rolled down my window another inch, just enough to fit my hand through. I could hear Lyle moving on the hood, probably repositioning himself to watch the window, and I knew I would only get one chance at this. When his face appeared at the gap, those pale eyes squinting down at me through the opening, I pressed the nozzle and sprayed directly into his eyes without hesitation. The sound he made was not quite human, this guttural shriek of pain and rage that cut through the storm like a blade. He fell backward off the hood, and I heard him hit the ground on the passenger side, cursing and coughing and clawing at his face. I did not wait to see if he could recover. I threw open my door against the snowbank, forcing it through the accumulation with strength I did not know I had, and I ran. The tarp was still covering my windshield. My tires were flat, and I had no phone signal, but none of that mattered anymore. I ran toward the direction the other car had gone, stumbling through knee-deep snow, the wind tearing at my coat and my hair and my face. Behind me, I could hear Lyle screaming my way, calling me names, telling me I was going to freeze to death out here, that I needed him, that I was making a mistake. I kept running. About a quarter mile down the road, I saw lights through the snow, not moving this time, but stationary, and I realized there was a farmhouse set back from the highway that I had not noticed before. I made it to their door somehow, collapsed against it, pounded until an elderly woman opened it with a shotgun in her hands, and her husband already on the phone with the sheriff. They brought me inside, wrapped me in blankets, gave me hot coffee while I shook so hard I could barely hold the cup. The sheriff's deputy, who arrived 40 minutes later, told me they found my car exactly where I left it. Tarp still on the windshield, 2 flat tires, but no sign of Lyle or his pickup truck anywhere on that stretch of highway. That was January of 2023, almost 2 years ago now. The police never found him, never even confirmed that someone matching his description lived anywhere in the county. The elderly couple, Frank and Margie Olson, told me later that they had heard rumors over the years about a man in a brown pickup who would cruise that stretch of highway during bad storms, looking for stranded drivers. They thought it was just one of those rural legends people tell to scare teenagers into checking their tires before winter. I think about what would have happened if my mother had not given me that pepper spray, if I had not remembered it was in my purse, if I had unlocked that door when he first asked me to. I think about the other car that drove past while I was screaming in the darkness, how close help was, and how completely invisible I had become. I still drive that highway when I visit my mother, but only in daylight now, only when the forecast is clear, and I always tell someone exactly when I am leaving and exactly when I should arrive. Sometimes, when I pass that spot where my car went into the snowbank, I slow down and look at the tree line, half expecting to see an old pickup truck idling there among the pines, waiting for the next storm to roll in. Minnesota winters have a reputation, but nothing prepares you for what happens when a storm decides to show you exactly how small and fragile you really are. I learned that lesson on a Thursday in early December of 2022, somewhere along Highway 53 between Virginia and Eveleth, two towns most people have never heard of, unless they grew up in the Iron Range. At 26, I had been working as an HVAC technician for almost 2 years, driving my company truck across frozen stretches of rural highway to fix furnaces for people who lived so far from everything that the nearest grocery store was an hour away. The job paid decent, the solitude suited me, and I had grown comfortable with long drives through empty landscapes. That comfort almost killed me. The forecast had mentioned snow, maybe 6 to 8 inches, nothing unusual for that part of the state. But forecasts lie sometimes, and this one lied in a way that nearly cost me my life. The first sign of trouble came when my windshield turned completely white in less than 30 seconds. One moment I could see the road, the faded yellow lines, the skeletal trees lining both sides. And then it was gone, all of it, swallowed by a wall of snow so thick it looked solid. I pulled over immediately, heart pounding, and watched the temperature display on my dashboard drop from 12 degrees to -4 in what felt like minutes. My truck, an old Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles of rust and stubbornness holding it together, started making a sound I had never heard before. A grinding, choking noise that ended with a shudder and then silence. I turned the key again and again, but the engine refused to respond. The heater died with it, and within 5 minutes I could see my breath forming thick clouds inside the cab. I remember sitting there, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, trying to calculate how long a person could survive in a broken-down truck during a blizzard with no cell signal, and no other cars in sight. My phone had 1 bar of signal that flickered in and out like a dying heartbeat. I tried calling 911 3 times, and each time the call dropped before it even connected. I sent a text to my boss, Hank, telling him my location and that I was stranded. The message sat there with a little spinning circle for 10 minutes before finally showing delivered. Whether he actually received it or not, I had no way of knowing. The cold was getting serious now, the kind that makes your fingers clumsy and your thoughts sluggish. I had a winter emergency kit in the back seat, blankets, hand warmers, a flashlight, some granola bars, because Hank drilled that into every new hire. I wrapped myself in both blankets and cracked open 2 hand warmers, pressing them against my chest. For a while, maybe an hour, I told myself this was manageable. Someone would come. A plow truck, a state trooper, another driver. But the snow kept falling so heavy that I could barely see the hood of my own truck, and the silence outside was absolute. No engines, no voices. Nothing but the wind screaming against the windows like something trying to get in. The decision to leave the truck was the dumbest thing I have ever done, and I knew it was dumb even as I was doing it. But hypothermia does something to your brain. It whispers to you, tells you that action is better than waiting, that movement means survival. I remembered passing a gas station maybe 2 miles back, a little place with a faded Conoco sign and a single pump out front. 2 miles. I had walked farther than that plenty of times. In my head, it made perfect sense. I would walk back, find the gas station, call for help from a warm building with a hot cup of coffee in my hands. I put on every layer I had. My work jacket, a hoodie underneath, 2 pairs of gloves, a beanie pulled low over my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and one of the blankets, wrapping it around my shoulders like a cape. When I opened the truck door, the wind hit me so hard I nearly fell backward. The cold was not just cold anymore. It was violence. It was a physical force that wanted to tear the heat right out of my body. I stepped out anyway, pulled the door shut behind me, and started walking in what I believed was the direction I had come from. The first 10 minutes were not so bad. I kept my head down, my chin tucked into my chest, and focused on putting one boot in front of the other. The road was somewhere beneath my feet. I could feel the firmness of asphalt under the snow, and I used that as my guide. Left foot, right foot, keep moving, stay on the hard surface. The blanket around my shoulders was already soaked through, heavy with snow that melted from my body heat and then froze again into a stiff, icy shell. My flashlight cut a weak yellow beam through the white chaos, illuminating maybe 3 feet ahead of me before the snow swallowed the light completely. I counted my steps to keep my mind occupied. 100, 200, 500. At around 800 steps, I realized I could no longer feel the road beneath me. The ground had become soft, uneven, and when I swept my boot sideways, I hit something that crunched, a frozen bush maybe, or the edge of a ditch. I stopped, turned around, and tried to find the road again. But there was no road. There was no anything. Just white in every direction, so thick and disorienting that I could not tell up from down, forward from backward. That was when the panic hit me, real and raw and absolute. I spun in a circle, waving my flashlight like it could somehow cut through the storm and show me where I was. Nothing. The wind had picked up even more, howling so loud it drowned out my own thoughts, and the snow was falling sideways now, stinging my face like tiny needles made of ice. I picked a direction, any direction, and started walking again, faster this time, almost running. My lungs burned from the cold air, each breath feeling like I was inhaling broken glass. I do not know how long I walked like that, stumbling through snow that came up past my knees in some places, tripping over things I could not see. 10 minutes maybe, 20. Time had stopped making sense. And then, through the white curtain ahead of me, I saw a light, a faint yellowish glow flickering like a candle in the distance. Relief flooded through me so hard my knees almost buckled. The gas station. I had found it. I pushed forward with everything I had left, my legs screaming, my fingers numb inside my gloves. My eyes locked on that beautiful, impossible light. The light vanished. 1 second it was there, warm and promising, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the storm like it had never existed at all. I stopped dead in my tracks, blinking hard, trying to find it again. Maybe the snow had just gotten thicker for a moment. Maybe I had looked away at the wrong time. I turned slowly, scanning the white emptiness around me, and that was when I saw it again. But now it was behind me, in the direction I had just come from. That made no sense. I had been walking toward it. How could it be behind me now? My brain tried to explain it away, telling me I had gotten turned around somehow, that the wind had spun me without me noticing. I started walking toward it again, my steps slower now, more careful. The cold had seeped so deep into my bones that I was no longer shivering, and some distant part of my mind, the part that still remembered the safety training videos Hank made us watch, knew that was a very bad sign. When you stop shivering, it means your body has given up trying to warm itself. It means you are running out of time. I do not know when I first heard the voice. It crept into my awareness slowly, like a radio station fading in through static. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my frozen ears. But then I heard it clearly, a man's voice somewhere to my left calling out a name. "Corbett," it said. "Corbett, over here." That was not my name. My name is Jensen. But in that moment, with my thoughts moving like cold syrup, I did not question it. I turned toward the voice and started walking. It felt so real, so close, like someone was standing just a few feet away in the white chaos. I even called back to them. "Hey," I shouted, or tried to shout. My voice came out cracked and weak, barely louder than a whisper. "Hey, I am here. I am over here." The voice kept calling, always just ahead of me, always just out of reach. "Corbett, Corbett, over here." I followed it like a dog following its owner, stumbling through the snow, no longer feeling my feet or my hands or most of my face. Some part of me knew something was wrong. Some part of me was screaming that there was no one out there, that I was alone, that my brain was breaking down from the cold. But that voice was the only thing I had left to hold on to, and I could not let it go. The next part is hard to explain because it did not feel like it was happening to me. It felt like I was watching myself from somewhere outside my own body, floating a few feet above this stumbling, frozen man who used to be Jensen from Duluth. The voice had stopped calling for Corbett, and now it was talking directly to me, asking me questions, telling me things, having a full conversation like we were old friends catching up over beers. I answered it. I know I did because my throat was raw afterward, scraped dry from all the talking. I cannot remember most of what we discussed. Fragments come back to me sometimes, in dreams that jolt me awake covered in sweat. Something about my father, who died when I was 19. Something about a girl I dated in high school, Melissa Hartman, who I had not thought about in years. The voice knew things about me, personal things, and at the time that seemed perfectly normal. Of course it knew. Of course this stranger in the storm knew about the time I crashed my bike into a mailbox when I was 7, or the night I cried in my truck after my dad's funeral because I could not cry in front of my mom. It all made sense in the way that dreams make sense, logical until you wake up and realize none of it was real. At some point I got hot. That sounds insane given the circumstances, but I remember the heat washing over me like I had stepped into a sauna. My jacket felt suffocating, my hoodie underneath like a wool blanket wrapped too tight. I needed to get them off. I needed air on my skin. I fumbled with the zipper of my jacket, my fingers so clumsy they felt like they belonged to someone else, and I managed to pull it open. The relief was immediate, a rush of cool air against my chest that felt like heaven. I shrugged the jacket off my shoulders and let it fall into the snow behind me. The blanket was already gone. I had dropped it somewhere, sometime. I could not remember when. My hoodie came off next, and then I was standing in the blizzard in nothing but a thin flannel shirt, and I felt perfect. I felt warm and comfortable and sleepy, so incredibly sleepy. The voice was still there, quieter now, more soothing. It told me I had been walking for so long. It told me I deserved a rest. Just a minute, it said. Just sit down for 1 minute and catch your breath, and then you can keep going. That sounded reasonable. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I sat down in the snow. Or maybe I fell. The line between intention and accident had blurred into nothing by then. The ground was soft and cold, but the cold did not bother me anymore. Nothing bothered me. I lay back, looking up at the white sky, watching the snowflakes fall toward my face in slow motion. They landed on my cheeks, my forehead, my open eyes, and I did not blink. The voice was still talking, but I could not make out the words anymore. It had become a hum, a gentle lullaby wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I thought about my mom, how worried she would be when I did not come home. I thought about Hank, wondering if he ever got my text. I thought about the gas station with the faded Conoco sign, how close it had seemed, how sure I had been that I could make it. My eyes started to close. The white world around me faded to gray, then to black, and the last thing I remember thinking was how peaceful it all felt. No more walking, No more cold. No more anything. Just sleep. Endless and perfect, pulling me down into somewhere warm and dark and quiet. I woke up in a hospital in Virginia 3 days later with frostbite on 7 of my fingers and both of my ears. A nurse told me I was lucky to be alive, that the search and rescue team had found me less than 20 minutes after I collapsed, following my footprints from the truck. She said it like it was a simple thing, like tracing a straight line through the snow. But when I talked to the paramedic who found me, a guy named Gentry with kind eyes and a thick gray beard, he told me a different story. He said my footprints did not make any sense. He said I had walked in circles, big looping circles over and over again, carving patterns into the snow like I was performing some kind of ritual. He said they found my jacket and my hoodie scattered 30 feet apart, and the blanket even farther, like I had been shedding pieces of myself along the way. And he said, "This is the part that still keeps me up at night, that when they found me lying in the snow, my lips were moving. I was talking to someone who was not there, having a full conversation, gesturing with my frozen hands like I was making a point in an argument. He asked me who I was talking to. I told him I did not remember. That was a lie. I remember exactly who I was talking to. I just do not know how to explain that the voice sounded exactly like my father, dead for 7 years, telling me it was okay to rest, that he would stay with me until I fell asleep. The doctors told me I lost the tips of 2 fingers on my left hand, the pinky and the ring finger just above the first knuckle. My ears healed eventually, though the left one still gets numb in cold weather and probably always will. I spent 2 weeks in that hospital, most of it hooked up to machines that beeped every few seconds and drove me half crazy. My mom drove up from Iowa the day after they found me and did not leave my side until I was discharged. She cried a lot, which made me cry, which made her cry more. Hank came to visit twice, brought me a card signed by everyone at the company, and told me my job would be waiting whenever I was ready. I went back to work 3 months later, but I do not take the rural routes anymore. I stay in Duluth now, fixing furnaces in apartment buildings and office complexes, places where the nearest gas station is a 5-minute walk and cell service never drops. Some of my co-workers think I got soft. Maybe I did. I do not care. I know what waits out there in the empty places when the cold decides to show you what you really are. I still think about that day more than I would like to admit. Sometimes when I am falling asleep at night, I hear the wind howling, and I am back in that white emptiness, following a light that does not exist toward a voice that should not be there. I talked to a therapist about it for a while. She said the hallucinations were a normal response to severe hypothermia, that my brain was shutting down and pulling up memories to keep me company while it happened. That makes sense. That is the scientific explanation, and I believe it. But there is another part of me, a small and stubborn part that I cannot quite silence, that wonders how a dying brain could know exactly what my father's voice sounded like, how it could remember the specific way he used to say my name, the cadence of his words, the warmth underneath his tone. The doctors say I was alone out there in the snow, walking in circles, talking to nobody. And I am sure they are right. I am sure of it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the winter wind rattles my windows, I am not so sure anymore. I am not sure at all. Nobody warns you about how quiet it gets when you're truly stuck. Not stuck in traffic, not stuck waiting for a tow truck in a parking lot, but stuck in the middle of nowhere with snow piling up around your car and no way to call anyone. I keep replaying that night in my head, trying to figure out what I could have done differently, and the answer is everything. My name is Heather, and I turned 34 last spring, which means I've been driving Michigan winters for almost 2 decades. I'm not careless, I'm not reckless, and I've never been the type to ignore a weather warning. But on that Saturday in January, I made one stupid decision after another, and by the time I realized how badly I'd messed up, it was way too late to fix any of it. I was coming back from my cousin's wedding in Traverse City, a 2.5-hour drive that should have been simple, and all I wanted was to sleep in my own bed instead of paying another $150 for a hotel room. The drive started fine. Highway 131 was clear for the first hour, just wet pavement and the occasional gust of wind rocking my Chevy Equinox. I'd checked the radar obsessively before leaving, and there was supposed to be a window of calm weather until around 10. The snow started earlier than predicted, right around 8:30, and within 20 minutes it went from light flurries to a full whiteout. I slowed down, turned my high beams off because they were just reflecting back at me, and tried to stay calm. When my GPS announced a faster route to avoid an accident on the highway, I took the exit without really thinking about it. The app said I'd save almost 30 minutes, and at that point I just wanted to get home as fast as possible. The road it sent me down looked fine at first, recently plowed, lined with pine trees heavy with snow. I didn't notice when the pavement turned to gravel, or when the tire tracks I was following got shallower and shallower until they disappeared completely. The GPS kept telling me to continue straight, so I did. The road narrowed, and the snow was deeper here, untouched by any plow. My Equinox handled it okay at first, the four-wheel drive doing its job, but I was going maybe 15 miles an hour and my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I remember thinking I should turn around, but there was nowhere to do it safely. The road was barely wide enough for one car, with steep ditches on both sides hidden under the snow. I told myself I'd find a driveway or a wider spot ahead, somewhere I could do a 3-point turn and get back to the highway. The GPS said I only had 11 miles left on this road before it connected to another county route. 11 miles. That's nothing. I could do 11 miles. I kept repeating that to myself like a prayer while the wind howled and the snow flew sideways across my headlights. I never saw the curve. 1 second I was crawling forward, squinting through the windshield, and the next my front tires hit something under the snow, maybe a rock or a frozen rut, and the car jerked hard to the right. I overcorrected, felt the back end swing out, and then I was sliding. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to scream. The Equinox went off the road and down into what I later realized was a shallow ravine, maybe 6 or 7 feet deep. The impact wasn't violent, more like sinking into a snowbank, but when I tried to reverse, the wheels just spun uselessly. I put it in drive, tried rocking back and forth, but I was stuck. Completely, hopelessly stuck. I sat there for a full minute just breathing, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I grabbed my phone to call for help and saw the 2 words that changed everything. No service. I tried moving the phone around, holding it up to the window, even cracking the door open and sticking my arm out into the freezing air. Nothing. Not a single bar. I was somewhere in the middle of rural Michigan on an unmaintained service road that probably hadn't seen traffic in weeks, and nobody knew where I was. I'd texted my roommate before leaving Traverse City to say I was on my way, but I hadn't mentioned the detour. My gas tank was at a quarter full, maybe enough to run the heat for a few hours if I was careful. The temperature outside was dropping fast, and the wind was making it feel even colder. I turned off the engine to conserve fuel and sat in the darkness, listening to the storm rage around me. The car creaked and groaned as gusts of wind battered it from all sides. Snow was already starting to pile up against the driver's side door. I checked the time on my phone. 9:47. It was going to be a long night. For the next hour, I cycled the engine on and off, running the heat for 10 minutes, then turning it off for 20. I rationed my water bottle and ate the granola bar I'd stuffed in my purse at the wedding reception. I kept checking my phone obsessively, hoping for even 1 bar of signal, but there was nothing. Around 11, I was starting to accept that I might have to wait until morning for someone to find me. I was scared, but I was also weirdly calm, like my brain had decided that panicking wouldn't help, so it just shut that part off. That's when I saw the headlights. They appeared in my rearview mirror first, 2 yellowish beams cutting through the snow maybe half a mile back. I sat up straight, my heart suddenly racing. Someone else was on this road. Someone who might have a phone that worked, or who could drive me to the nearest gas station. I turned my hazard lights on and started honking the horn, short bursts every few seconds, praying they would see me. The vehicle came closer, moving slow through the snow, and I could see it was a pickup truck, one of those big Ford F-150s with the extended cab. It stopped about 50 feet behind me, headlights still on, engine running. I waited for the driver to get out to come check on me, but nothing happened. The truck just sat there, idling, for what felt like forever but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. I remember feeling confused more than anything. Why wasn't he getting out? Maybe he was on the phone calling for help. Maybe he was trying to figure out the best way to approach. I flashed my hazards again and gave another honk, a longer one this time. Still nothing. Then, slowly, the truck started moving again. Not toward me on the road, but off to the side, crunching through the deep snow until it was positioned perpendicular to the road itself. The driver cut the wheel and maneuvered the F-150 until it was completely blocking any path forward or back. Only then did the door open. A man stepped out. He was big, tall and heavy-set, wearing a dark coat and one of those knit caps pulled low over his forehead. I couldn't see his face clearly because his headlights were behind him, turning him into a silhouette against all that white snow. He stood there for a moment just looking at my car. Then he reached back into his truck and pulled something out. It took me a second to recognize what it was, a tire iron, the kind with the cross shape that you use to loosen lug nuts. He held it loosely in his right hand, tapping it against his thigh as he started walking toward me. Not rushing, not running, just this slow, deliberate walk like he had all the time in the world. The relief I'd felt when I saw his headlights was completely gone now. In its place was something else, a cold, sick feeling that started in my stomach and spread through my whole body. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong with this situation. I locked my doors. It was automatic, just a reflex, and the click of the lock seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the car. The man stopped walking when he heard it. He was maybe 20 feet away now, close enough that I could see he was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Not the kind of smile someone gives you when they're about to help you out of a bad spot. It was the smile of someone who knew they had all the power and you had none. He said something, but I couldn't hear it through the closed window and the wind. He gestured with the tire iron, pointing at my door, then made a cranking motion like he wanted me to roll down my window. I shook my head. He took another step closer. My mind was racing through options and coming up empty. I couldn't drive away because my car was stuck. I couldn't call for help because I had no signal. I couldn't outrun him in knee-deep snow wearing the dress flats I'd worn to the wedding. The only thing between me and this man was a couple inches of glass and some sheet metal, and he had a tool designed specifically for breaking things. He walked around to the front of my car, taking his time, looking at how I was stuck in the ravine. Then he came to the driver's side window and knocked on it with the tire iron. 3 slow taps that made the glass vibrate. He leaned down and I saw his face for the first time. He looked normal. That was the worst part. Not like a monster, not like a movie villain. Just a regular guy, maybe mid-40s with a patchy beard and small dark eyes. He could have been someone's neighbor, someone's co-worker, someone you'd pass in the grocery store without a second glance. He said something again, and this time I could make out the words through the glass. He said I looked cold. He said he could help me warm up. The way he said it made my skin prickle with fear. I grabbed the only thing I could find, an ice scraper with a heavy plastic handle, and held it up so he could see it. He laughed. Actually laughed, like I'd just told him a joke. He raised the tire iron and I thought, this is it. He's going to smash the window and drag me out. I was already bracing myself, trying to figure out where to hit him with the scraper when he came through. But then something happened. Headlights, more headlights, coming from the same direction his truck had come from. He saw them too, and his whole body language changed. He stepped back from my window, looked at the approaching vehicle, then looked back at me. For a second we just stared at each other, and I could see him calculating, weighing his options. The new headlights were getting closer, and I could hear the engine now, something big like another truck or maybe an SUV. The man with the tire iron took one more look at me, and what I saw in his eyes terrified me more than anything else that night. It wasn't anger or frustration at being interrupted. It was patience, like he was just putting something on pause, something he fully intended to come back to later. He walked back to his truck without hurrying, climbed in, and drove off into the storm, his taillights disappearing in seconds. The other vehicle turned out to be a county plow truck doing an emergency run on the main road about a mile east. The driver, a guy named Pete who looked like he was in his 60s, said he'd seen tire tracks going down the service road and figured someone might be in trouble. He called dispatch on his radio, and within an hour there was a tow truck pulling my Equinox out of the ravine and a sheriff's deputy taking my statement. I told them everything, described the man, described his truck, gave them the partial plate number I'd somehow managed to memorize in those terrifying minutes. They said they'd look into it. That was almost a year ago now. They never found him, no arrests, no suspects, nothing. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, driving those back roads during snowstorms, looking for someone else whose GPS sent them the wrong way. I sold my Equinox 2 months after that night. I couldn't stand sitting in it anymore. Couldn't stop seeing his face in the window every time I got behind the wheel. I take the highway now, always, even if it adds an hour to my trip. And when the snow starts falling, I don't drive at all. I just stay home, lock my doors, and wait for it to pass. February in northern Wisconsin had always been unforgiving, but I had no idea what was waiting for me on that Saturday night in 2024. My name is Connor Aldrich, and at the time I had just wrapped up my 10th year working as a site supervisor for a construction company based out of Ashland. My wife had left 3 days earlier to visit her sister in Milwaukee, taking our dog with her, which meant I had the house to myself when the blizzard warning started rolling in. Our place sat about 2 miles outside the main town, a modest ranch-style home my grandfather built in the 60s, surrounded by nothing but white pine and silence. The forecast called for 18 inches minimum, with winds gusting up to 50 miles per hour. By late afternoon, I had already stocked up on firewood, filled the bathtub with water in case the pipes froze, and resigned myself to a weekend of bad television and canned soup. The snow began falling around 4 in the afternoon, gentle at first, almost peaceful, before transforming into something violent and horizontal by nightfall. By 9 that evening, I could barely see the outline of my own mailbox from the living room window, and that mailbox stood maybe 30 feet from the house. The wind screamed through the trees with a sound like freight trains, and every few minutes I heard branches cracking somewhere in the darkness, snapping under the weight of ice and snow. I had the fireplace going strong, a Packers game playing on low volume, and a half-finished beer warming in my hand. The power had flickered twice already but held steady, which felt like a small miracle given how the storm was raging outside. My phone showed no service, not unusual out here during bad weather, when the cell towers got overwhelmed or damaged. I remember feeling grateful that I had nowhere to be, no reason to venture out into that white chaos. The isolation felt comfortable, even cozy, the way it does when you know you are safe inside while nature throws its worst tantrum just beyond your walls. That sense of safety would not last much longer. The pounding started around 10:15. Not a knock, pounding. 3 heavy strikes against the front door that cut straight through the noise of the storm and made me jump hard enough to spill beer down my shirt. My first thought was that a branch had blown against the house, maybe slammed into the doorframe with the wind. But then it came again, deliberate and rhythmic, and I heard voices. Muffled, barely audible over the howling gusts, but definitely human voices calling out from my front porch. I muted the television and stood there in the sudden silence of my living room, heart beating fast, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Nobody should have been out in that storm. The roads had been closed since 7. The county sheriff had announced it on the radio, and my driveway alone was a 1/4 mile of unplowed gravel that would have buried any normal vehicle up to its axles. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the coat closet, an old Louisville Slugger from my high school days, and approached the door slowly, keeping to the side of the window. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I could make out 2 figures standing on my porch, bundled in dark clothing with bright strips of reflective material on their shoulders and chests. One of them leaned close to the door and shouted something I could not quite hear, then pounded again. 3 more strikes that rattled the door in its frame. I flipped on the porch light, which barely cut through the swirling white chaos outside, and called out asking who was there. A man's voice came back, loud and insistent, identifying himself as emergency services and saying I needed to evacuate immediately. He said something about structural collapse risks, that the county had issued mandatory evacuations for this area, that I needed to come with them right now. The woman beside him nodded vigorously, her face half hidden behind a scarf, and pointed toward the darkness behind them where I assumed their vehicle must have been parked. Something about the whole scene made the hair on my arm stand straight up, though I could not have told you exactly why in that moment. I asked them to hold up their identification to the window, and the man complied, pressing a laminated badge against the glass. The porch light caught it just enough for me to read the words, Bayfield County Emergency Management, printed across the top with a photo and a name I could not quite make out. It looked official at first glance, but something was wrong. The badge had no hologram, no embossed seal, nothing that matched the credentials I had seen on actual county workers who came through our construction sites for inspections. The photo seemed slightly off-center, printed on regular paper and slipped into a plastic sleeve you could buy at any office supply store. I looked past him toward where their vehicle should have been, and saw only a dark shape maybe 50 feet back. No flashing lights, no emergency markings, just what looked like a regular pickup truck with the headlights off. Real rescue teams would have arrived in marked vehicles with strobes blazing, especially in conditions this bad. Real rescue teams would have called ahead using emergency broadcast systems or knocked on doors with police escort. These two had appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a blizzard with homemade badges and a civilian truck, telling me I needed to leave my warm house immediately. The man started talking faster when I did not open the door, his voice taking on an edge of frustration that did not sound like concern for my safety. He said the roof could cave in any minute, that 3 other houses in the area had already collapsed, that I was putting myself in serious danger by staying inside. The woman chimed in, saying they had a warming shelter set up at the community center, and that I needed to come now, right now. There was no time to wait. I noticed she kept glancing to her left, back toward that dark truck, like she was checking on something or someone. I told them I appreciated the warning, but my house was solid, built to withstand Wisconsin winters for 60 years, and I would take my chances. The man's whole demeanor changed then. He leaned closer to the door, close enough that I could see his breath fogging up the glass, and said in a lower voice that they could not leave me here, that they had orders to bring everyone out, that I needed to open the door so they could explain the situation properly. He said the word orders like it meant something, like I should be impressed or intimidated. I tightened my grip on the bat and told them I was not going anywhere. That was when the woman spoke up again, and what she said sent a chill straight through me that had nothing to do with the cold. She said they understood my hesitation, that people get scared during emergencies, but that they really needed to come inside for just a moment to assess the structural damage from within. She said it would only take 5 minutes, that they had thermal imaging equipment in the truck that could detect stress fractures in the foundation, and they needed to check my basement. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, like she was reading from a script she had practiced many times before. The man nodded along, and actually put his hand on the door handle, giving it a slow experimental turn. The deadbolt held, thank God, but the fact that he tried it at all made my heart start hammering against my ribs. I backed up a few steps and shouted through the door that if they did not leave my property immediately, I would call the police. The man laughed at that, a short, ugly sound, and said good luck getting through to anyone tonight, that the phone lines were down across the whole county, that they were the only help available for miles around. He said it like a threat, like he wanted me to understand just how alone I really was out here. I retreated to the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the front door, and grabbed the landline phone from its cradle on the wall. Dead silence, no dial tone, just like he said. My cell phone still showed no service, the little icon at the top of the screen completely empty. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest and forced myself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to not let fear make my decisions for me. The pounding started again, harder this time, and I heard the man yelling that they were running out of time, that the storm was getting worse, that I was being unreasonable. Between his shouts, I could hear them talking to each other in low voices I could not make out. And then I heard footsteps moving off the porch, crunching through the snow around the side of the house. They were circling the property, checking the windows, looking for another way in. I moved quickly through each room on the ground floor, confirming that every window was locked, every latch secured. When I reached the back door in the mudroom, I found the woman standing right there on the other side of the glass, her face inches from the window, staring directly at me with eyes that held no warmth at all. She did not say anything, just stood there watching me through the frost-covered glass while the snow swirled around her like a white curtain. I stepped back and nearly tripped over a pair of work boots, catching myself on the washing machine. She tilted her head slightly, almost curious, then raised one gloved hand and tapped a finger against the window 3 times. Slow, deliberate, patient. I heard the man's voice calling from somewhere around the front of the house, asking if she had found anything, and she turned away without answering and disappeared back into the storm. My hands were trembling as I checked the lock on the mudroom door, confirmed it was secure, then dragged a heavy wooden bench in front of it for good measure. I needed to get help, needed to reach someone, but every form of communication I had was dead or useless. Then I remembered the old CB radio in the basement, the one my grandfather had installed decades ago for emergencies exactly like this one. I had not used it in years, was not even sure it still worked, but it ran on its own battery backup and operated on frequencies that had nothing to do with cell towers or phone lines. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and descended the basement stairs as quietly as I could, wincing at every creak of the old wooden steps. The basement was cold and dark, filled with the smell of dust and old concrete, and I had to navigate past stacks of storage boxes and forgotten furniture to reach the workbench where the radio sat. The unit looked ancient, all brown plastic and silver dials, but when I flipped the power switch, a small red light blinked on, and I nearly cried with relief. I picked up the handset and started cycling through channels, calling out for anyone who could hear me, identifying myself and my address and saying I had intruders on my property, pretending to be emergency services. Static answered me on the first 3 channels, then the 4th, then the 5th. On channel 9, I finally heard a voice crackle through, a woman asking me to repeat my location. I gave her my address again and explained the situation as quickly as I could. 2 people claiming to be county emergency workers, fake badges, no marked vehicle, trying to force their way into my home. There was a pause, then the woman said she was patching me through to the Bayfield County Emergency Dispatch. After what felt like an eternity, a man's voice came on the line and asked me to describe what was happening. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. He said no evacuation teams had been dispatched anywhere in the county tonight. He said all emergency personnel were grounded due to the severity of the storm. He said whoever was outside my house, they were not with any government agency he knew of. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, to keep the doors locked, and that he would try to get a sheriff's deputy to my location as soon as the roads allowed. But that could be hours, maybe longer, depending on the storm. He asked if I had any weapons in the house, and I told him about the bat and the hunting rifle my father left me, still locked in a cabinet upstairs. He said to get the rifle, load it, and make it clear to anyone trying to enter that I was armed and prepared to defend myself. His voice was steady, but I could hear the urgency underneath, the understanding that I was on my own for now, and that the situation was serious. I thanked him and set the handset down on the workbench, leaving the channel open, then made my way back upstairs as quietly as I could. The house was darker now. The power had finally gone out while I was in the basement, and I had to navigate by flashlight through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar and hostile. I retrieved the rifle from the upstairs closet, loaded it with hands that refused to stay steady, and crept back down to the living room. Through the front window, I could see both figures standing in my driveway now, conferring with each other near their truck, their silhouettes barely visible through the driving snow. They seemed to be arguing about something, gesturing toward the house, toward the road, toward each other. I made a decision then that might have been stupid, but felt necessary. I switched on the porch light, unlocked the front door, and opened it just wide enough to show myself standing there with the rifle raised and pointed directly at them. I shouted over the wind that I had contacted the county sheriff, that deputies were on their way, and that if they set foot on my property again, I would shoot them where they stood. The man took a step toward me, and I chambered around with a sound that cut through the storm like a thunderclap. He stopped. The woman grabbed his arm and pulled him back, saying something I could not hear, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then, without another word, they both turned and walked back to their truck. The engine started, the headlights flicked on, and they backed slowly down my driveway until the taillights disappeared into the white void of the blizzard. I stood there in the doorway for another 5 minutes, rifle still raised, watching the empty space where they had been, before finally stepping back inside and locking the door behind me. My whole body was shaking, not from cold, but from the adrenaline that had no place left to go. The sheriff's deputy did not arrive until almost 6 in the morning, after the worst of the storm had passed and the plows had managed to clear the main roads. His name was Russell Engel, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray mustache and tired eyes that suggested he had been dealing with emergencies all night. I showed him the footprints around my house, though the snow had filled most of them in, and described everything that had happened in as much detail as I could remember. He took notes without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression growing darker as the story went on. When I finished, he told me I was not the first call he had received that night. 2 other homes in isolated parts of the county had reported similar encounters. Strangers claiming to be emergency workers, insisting residents evacuate immediately, becoming aggressive when refused entry. One elderly woman had actually opened her door, and by the time a neighbor checked on her the next day, her house had been stripped of valuables and she was found locked in her own basement, dehydrated but alive. Deputy Engel said they were working with state police to identify the suspects, that the fake badges and the pickup truck matched descriptions from the other incidents, but so far no arrests had been made. He gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else or if the strangers came back. They never did come back, at least not to my house. 6 weeks later, I read in the local paper that 2 people had been arrested in connection with a string of burglaries targeting rural homes during severe weather events. Their method was always the same: wait for a major storm, cut phone lines if possible, show up in fake emergency gear, and convince people to leave their homes unprotected. If the residents refused, they would move on to easier targets, but sometimes they got more aggressive. The article did not show their faces, but it mentioned a man and a woman in their late 30s, both with prior convictions for theft and fraud. I never found out for certain if they were the same pair who stood on my porch that night, but I believe they were. My wife came home 2 days after the storm and I told her everything, and for months afterwards she refused to stay in the house alone. We installed a security system that spring, added motion sensor lights around the entire property, and I taught her how to use the CB radio just in case. Every time a big storm rolls through now, I find myself checking the locks twice, 3 times, listening for footsteps on the porch, watching the driveway for headlights that should not be there. I know I did the right thing by not opening that door, but some nights I still lie awake wondering what would have happened if I had. What they would have done, where I would have ended up. The storm outside passes eventually, but that question never really goes away. My grandmother left me 40 acres of farmland outside of Bozeman, Montana, when she passed in the spring of 2017. At 26, inheriting a farmhouse seemed like a better deal than paying rent in Portland, where I had lived since graduating college. Most of my friends thought I had lost my mind, moving alone to a place where the nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a dirt road, and the closest grocery store required a 40-minute drive. But something about the silence called to me, the way darkness actually meant darkness out there, not the orange glow of streetlights bleeding through curtains. I had been on the property for about 8 months when winter arrived in full force, and I believed I understood what isolation truly meant. I was wrong about that. You do not understand isolation until a blizzard erases every familiar landmark, until the road vanishes and the fences disappear, and your farmhouse becomes the only thing that exists in an endless white void. That morning, the weather radio had been spitting warnings about an incoming storm system since before dawn. By noon, snow fell in thick curtains that cut visibility down to maybe 20 feet. I had done everything right, stocked the pantry with canned goods, filled the generator with fuel, brought extra firewood inside, charged my phone to full. The farmhouse itself was solid, built by my great-grandfather in 1952, with walls thick enough to muffle the wind, and a wood-burning stove that could heat the entire first floor. Around 3 in the afternoon, I stood at the kitchen window watching the world erase itself, feeling that particular smugness of being prepared while nature threw its worst at the walls. The wind screamed so loud I could feel it vibrating in my chest. That is probably why I did not hear him at first, why his moaning had to rise above the storm before it finally broke through to me, a sound so human and desperate that it cut straight through the howling chaos outside. I thought I was imagining it at first. When you live alone in a place that quiet, your brain starts inventing sounds just to fill the emptiness. But then I heard it again, louder, a man groaning in pain somewhere close to the house. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer by the sink and moved to the front door, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The moaning continued, raw and agonized, coming from directly outside on the porch. My heart was pounding as I unlatched the deadbolt and cracked the door open just enough to aim the flashlight beam into the swirling snow. And there he was, crumpled on my front steps like a puppet with its strings cut, a man in a brown canvas jacket and jeans clutching his right leg and grimacing up at me through the ice crystals clinging to his eyebrows and beard. He looked maybe 40, 45, with a weathered face and pale blue eyes that squinted against the flashlight. He was shivering violently, his lips already taking on a bluish tint that terrified me more than anything else. He said his name was Ray, that he had been driving on the county road when the storm got too bad, and he pulled over to wait it out. He told me he had tried to walk to find help when his car started losing heat, but he slipped on a patch of ice about 100 yards from my driveway and felt something snap in his ankle. He had crawled the rest of the way, he said, following the faint glow of my porch light through the blizzard. His voice came out in stuttering gasps between shivers, and even though something in the back of my mind whispered that I should be careful, I could not leave a man to freeze to death on my doorstep. I grabbed him under the arms and dragged him into the mudroom, his injured leg trailing behind him as he cried out in pain. The cold that came in with him was savage, biting at my exposed skin, and I slammed the door shut against the storm with my shoulder while he lay on the floor, groaning and thanking me over and over. I called 911 immediately, my fingers clumsy on the phone screen. The dispatcher told me what I already knew, that the roads were impassable and emergency services were stretched thin across the county. She said they would send someone as soon as conditions allowed, but that could be hours, maybe longer. She asked me to keep him warm, elevate the injured leg, watch for signs of severe frostbite. When I hung up, Ray was watching me from the mudroom floor with those pale blue eyes, and he smiled in a way that was probably meant to be grateful, but came across as something else, something I could not quite name. I helped him hop into the living room, his arm slung over my shoulder, his weight pressing against me as he winced with every movement. I got him settled on the couch near the wood stove, wrapped him in the heavy wool blanket my grandmother had kept draped over the armchair, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. That was when I noticed the first thing that did not add up. From the kitchen window, I could see the side of the porch and part of the front yard, visibility slightly better now that the wind had shifted direction. I looked at the spot where Ray claimed he had crawled up the steps, expecting to see some kind of trail, A disturbed path in the snow, marks from his hands and knees. But the snow on the steps looked smooth, almost untouched except for the mess we had made dragging him inside. I told myself the storm must have covered his tracks in the minutes between his arrival and when I looked, but the math did not work. He had been moaning outside for at least a couple of minutes before I opened the door, and the steps were sheltered under the porch overhang. The snow there should not have accumulated that fast. I stared at the pristine white surface and felt a cold knot forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I brought him the coffee and sat in the armchair across from the couch, watching him wrap his hands around the mug. He drank slowly, his eyes moving around the room in a way that felt too deliberate, too calculating, lingering on the doorways and windows before settling back on me. He asked how long I had lived here alone, and I lied without thinking, told him my boyfriend was upstairs sleeping off a cold. Ray nodded, but something flickered in his expression, a tiny shift that told me he did not believe a word of it. He asked if the upstairs bedrooms had locks on the doors, said he was just wondering because he did not want to impose, wanted to make sure I felt safe with a stranger in the house. The question landed wrong, too specific, too focused on security. I told him the bedroom doors were old, that none of them locked properly anymore, which was the truth but felt like a mistake the moment it left my mouth. He nodded again, slower this time, and took another sip of his coffee. His ankle, the one he said was broken, rested on the cushion I had propped up for him, but I realized I had not actually seen any swelling, any bruising, nothing but his word that it was injured at all. I excused myself to check on the generator, which was a lie, but I needed to get away from him for a minute to think. The generator was in the mudroom, and I stood there pretending to examine it while my mind raced through everything that had happened. His story about the car on the county road, but I had not heard any engine, had not seen any headlights through the storm before he appeared. The missing crawl marks on the porch steps. The way he asked about locks, about which rooms secured from the inside. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 again, keeping my voice low. The same dispatcher answered, and I asked her, trying to sound casual, if anyone had reported an abandoned vehicle on the county road near my address. She checked and told me no, nothing had been called in, no stranded motorists in my area at all. I thanked her and said I would call back if I needed anything, then hung up and pressed my back against the mudroom wall, my breath coming shallow and fast. Either Ray had lied about the car, or he had lied about which road he had been on, or he had lied about everything. I went back to the living room and found him standing by the window, his weight balanced evenly on both legs, peering out into the storm. He turned when he heard me, and for just a second his face held an expression I cannot properly describe, something blank and appraising, like a person calculating odds. Then the mask slipped back on, the pained grimace, the slight hunch as he shifted weight off his supposedly broken ankle. He said he thought he heard something outside, maybe an animal. I told him to sit back down, that he should not be standing on that leg, and watched as he made a show of limping back to the couch. But I had seen it now, the way he moved when he thought I was not looking, smooth and steady with no trace of injury. My grandmother kept a shotgun in the hall closet, unloaded, but with shells on the top shelf behind some old photo albums. I had never fired it, never even held it properly, but knowing it was there gave me something to hold on to mentally. I sat back down in the armchair and kept my phone in my hand, pretending to scroll through something while I watched Ray from the corner of my eye. He started asking more questions, casual on the surface but pointed underneath. How far was the nearest neighbor? Whether the county plowed my road, or if I had to hire someone private. If I had family nearby who checked on me during storms. Each question peeled back another layer of my safety, mapping my vulnerabilities with the precision of someone who had done this before. I gave vague answers, mentioned neighbors closer than they actually were, invented a brother who lived in town and visited often. Ray nodded along, but his eyes had changed, harder now, less concerned with maintaining the pretense of a grateful injured stranger. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance I heard a sound that made my whole body go rigid. It was faint, almost lost in the storm, but distinct enough to recognize. A door, the barn door, slamming open and shut in the wind. Except I had latched that door myself before the storm hit, secured it with a padlock because the latch alone was not strong enough to hold against heavy gusts. Someone had opened it. Ray heard it too. I saw his head turn toward the sound, and for a moment his composure cracked. A flash of something that looked almost like anticipation crossing his features before he caught himself. He asked what that noise was, his voice still playing the part of the concerned stranger. But there was an undercurrent to it now, an eagerness he could not quite hide. I told him it was probably just the wind, that old buildings made noise in storms, but my heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. I stood up slowly, said I was going to check on something, and walked toward the hallway with measured steps, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. The closet was 10 feet away. I could feel Ray's eyes on my back, tracking my movement, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I reached for that shotgun, he would drop the act completely. So I walked past the closet, continued to the bathroom, and locked the door behind me. I turned on the faucet to cover the sound of my voice and called 911 for the third time, whispering into the phone that I needed help immediately, that the man in my house was not injured, and I believed someone else was outside. The dispatcher kept me on the line, told me a county sheriff unit was already en route because of my earlier call, that they had prioritized my address when they saw multiple contacts from the same number. She asked me to stay where I was, to keep the door locked, to not engage with the man. I could hear Ray moving around in the living room, his footsteps steady and unhurried, no limp at all now. Then I heard him try the bathroom door handle, a slow, deliberate turn that stopped when it met the lock. He did not say anything. He just stood there on the other side of the door, and I stood on mine, the phone pressed to my ear, the faucet running, both of us waiting. The minutes stretched into something unbearable, thick and suffocating, until finally I heard a new sound cutting through the storm. An engine. Headlights swept across the frosted bathroom window, red and blue flashing through the glass, and Ray's footsteps retreated fast toward the back of the house. I heard the mudroom door slam open, the howl of the wind rushing in, and then the dispatcher was telling me the deputies were at the front door. I let them in with trembling hands. 2 officers covered in snow, their faces red from the cold. I tried to explain everything at once, the man, the fake injury, the questions about locks, the barn door. One of them stayed with me while the other went after Ray, disappearing into the white chaos behind the house with his flashlight beam cutting through the snow. They caught him about 200 yards out, trying to make his way toward the tree line. He was walking fine, running even, until the deputy tackled him into a snowdrift. When they brought him back in cuffs, his face had changed completely. No more friendly gratitude, no more wounded stranger, just cold, empty anger, the look of someone whose plan had fallen apart. The deputy who stayed with me asked to see my ankle, and Ray just stared at him without blinking, without answering. There was nothing wrong with his leg, no break, no sprain, no injury of any kind. He had crawled onto my porch and faked the whole thing. Every wince and groan and grateful smile, all of it theater designed to get inside my house. But that was not the worst part. As the storm began to ease around midnight, one of the deputies walked the perimeter of the property with a high-powered flashlight. He found footprints circling the barn, fresh enough that the snow had not filled them in completely. A second set of tracks, smaller than Ray's boots, leading from the barn to the back of the house and then retreating into the fields when the police lights appeared. Someone else had been out there the whole time, waiting in the dark, watching my windows. The deputy told me they found the barn door hanging open, the padlock cut clean through with bolt cutters. Inside, scratched into the wooden wall beside the door, were 2 words that still show up in my nightmares. She's alone. They never caught the second person. Ray refused to talk, gave a fake name that led nowhere, and eventually went to prison for breaking and entering and attempted burglary, though everyone involved knew it would have been much worse than burglary. I sold the farm 3 months later, moved back to Portland, and spent the next year sleeping with every light on and a chair wedged under my bedroom door. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, certain I can hear someone moaning outside my window, and I wonder if the one they never caught is still out there somewhere, waiting for another blizzard, another isolated farmhouse, another woman kind enough to open her door. Fights with my stepdad never ended well, but that night was different. He had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon, and when he started in on how I was wasting my life working at a warehouse instead of going to college, I lost it. Words were said, a lamp got knocked over, and my mom just stood there crying instead of telling him to stop. I turned 26 in November, old enough to know better than walking out into a snowstorm, but young enough to still make that exact stupid decision. February in upstate New York does not care about your feelings, and the snow had been falling sideways since lunch. I grabbed my coat off the hook, shoved my feet into my old sneakers, and slammed the door behind me. Town was only 2 miles down Garrison Road. I figured I would make it to the diner, get some coffee, and call my buddy Ray to pick me up once I calmed down. 15 minutes into that walk, I knew I had made a serious mistake. The plows had stopped running hours ago, and the snow was already up past my ankles, soaking through my jeans and freezing against my skin. I could not feel my toes anymore, and my fingers were going numb, even shoved deep in my pockets. The streetlights along the road were completely dark, probably from downed power lines somewhere up the hill. I had not seen a single car, not one set of headlights, since I left the house. Everything was white and gray and silent except for the wind cutting through my coat. I kept telling myself the Sunoco station near the old bridge was maybe half a mile ahead, that I could warm up there and figure out my next move. That is when I heard it behind me, an engine rumbling low and slow, tires grinding through the snow at a pace that matched my walking exactly. I glanced back and saw headlights cutting through the snow, maybe 30 feet behind me. A pickup truck, dark-colored, moving at a crawl. My first thought was relief, maybe someone who could give me a ride into town. But the truck did not speed up or slow down, just kept that same creeping pace like it was following me on purpose. I turned back around and walked a little faster, and I swear the engine revved just slightly to keep up. My heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I told myself I was being paranoid, that whoever it was probably just could not see well in the storm and was being careful. But something in my gut said otherwise. The truck stayed right there, not passing me, not honking, not doing anything a normal person would do, just following. After about 2 minutes of this, the horn gave a short honk and the truck pulled up beside me, passenger window rolling down with a mechanical whine. The driver leaned over toward the open window, and I got my first look at him. He was maybe 50, heavy-set, with a thick gray beard and a camouflage hunting cap pulled low on his forehead. The cab light was on, and I could see fast food wrappers on the dashboard and a bunch of stuff piled on the back seat. He smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes, like he was performing friendliness instead of feeling it. He asked me what the hell I was doing out here in this weather, said I was going to freeze to death if I kept walking. His voice was calm, almost too calm, like he had rehearsed this. I told him I was fine, that town was not far. He shook his head and said the roads ahead were completely blocked, that I would never make it on foot. He told me to get in, that he would take me wherever I needed to go. The windshield wipers were slapping back and forth, and the heat pouring out of that open window felt incredible against my frozen face. Part of me wanted to climb in so badly just to get warm. I made the decision that I still regret to this day. I walked around the front of the truck, headlights blinding me for a second, and climbed into the passenger seat. The heat inside was almost painful against my frozen skin, and I pressed my hands against the vents like they were the only things keeping me alive. The man said his name was Chet, and he asked me mine. I told him, and he repeated it back to me slowly, like he was tasting it. He put the truck in drive and started moving, and I told him I just needed to get to the main strip in town, that the diner would be fine. He nodded and said, "Sure, no problem." But then he turned left at the next intersection instead of going straight. I knew these roads my whole life, and left took you away from town, deeper into the farmland and woods that stretched for miles. I asked him where he was going, trying to keep my voice steady. He said the main road was blocked by a jackknifed semi, that he knew a back way. I had no way to know if that was true or not, but my phone had no signal, and the storm was getting worse by the second. Chet started asking me questions, and at first they seemed normal enough. Where did I live? What did I do for work? Was I married? I answered with short responses, watching the road and trying to figure out where we were. But then the questions got stranger. He asked if I lived alone, if anyone knew I was out walking tonight. He asked if my family would be worried about me, and when I said yes, he got quiet for a long moment before saying, "That was good, that family should worry about each other." The way he said it made my skin prickle even in that hot cab. I noticed he kept glancing at me instead of the road, these quick sideways looks like he was studying me. The truck was moving slow because of the snow, maybe 20 miles an hour, and I realized I had no idea how long we had been driving. 10 minutes, maybe 15. We should have hit some landmark by now, some house or barn or crossroad I recognized. But everything outside was just white darkness and trees I had never seen before. I tried to stay calm and think. My door was unlocked. I had checked that when I got in, but jumping out of a moving vehicle in a blizzard with no idea where I was seemed like trading one death for another. Chet had gone quiet, and somehow that was worse than the questions. He was humming something under his breath, this tuneless little melody that kept repeating. I noticed things I had not seen before. There was a coil of rope on the floor behind my seat, thick and yellow, the kind you would use to tie down equipment. A roll of duct tape in the cup holder between us, silver and half-used. A flashlight wedged between his seat and the center console. None of these things meant anything on their own, I told myself. People keep all kinds of stuff in their trucks. But my body was reacting before my mind could catch up, my leg muscles tensing, my breathing getting shallow. I asked him again how much farther, and he said not long, just a few more miles. He reached over and patted my knee twice, and I had to stop myself from flinching away. His hand was heavy and warm even through my wet jeans, and he let it rest there for just a second too long before pulling it back. The truck turned down an even narrower road, and now there were no tire tracks ahead of us at all. We were the first vehicle to come this way since the storm started, which meant we were nowhere near any main route. The trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping against the truck like fingers trying to get in. Chet asked me if I had a boyfriend, and when I did not answer right away, he laughed this low chuckle and said he was just making conversation. He said it must be lonely being out in a storm like this, that people needed to look out for each other. I was gripping the door handle so tight my knuckles ached, trying to calculate if I could survive a fall into the snow at this speed. Then I saw it up ahead, a faint glow through the trees. Lights, some kind of building with actual power. Chet saw it too, and I watched his jaw tighten for just a second before he relaxed again. He said we could stop there for a minute if I wanted. Let the storm calm down a bit. I said yes immediately, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. It was a small gas station, one of those old independent places with 2 pumps and a little convenience store attached. The lights were on inside, and I could see someone moving behind the counter through the foggy window. Chet pulled up next to the pumps but did not turn off the engine. He said he would wait here, that I should go in and warm up for a minute, use the bathroom if I needed to. The way he said it made it clear he expected me to come back out. I nodded and opened the door, and the cold hit me like a punch after all that time in the heated cab. I walked toward the store entrance, forcing myself not to run, not to look back. I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. The bell above the door jingled when I pushed it open, and the warmth inside smelled like coffee and hot dogs turning on those metal rollers. There was a woman behind the counter, maybe 60 years old, with reading glasses pushed up on her gray hair. She looked up at me and her expression changed when she saw my face. I must have looked terrified because she immediately asked if I was okay. I told her I needed help, that the man outside had picked me up and I did not feel safe. The words came out in a rush, my voice cracking. She did not hesitate, did not ask me if I was sure or tell me I was overreacting. She just reached under the counter and pulled out a cordless phone, then pointed to a door behind the chip display and told me to go back there and stay put. I heard her pick up the phone and start dialing as I walked to the back. The room was a tiny office, just a desk covered in papers and a chair with a ripped cushion. There was a small window near the ceiling, and I looked out and could see the truck still sitting there. Engine running, exhaust rising white into the storm. Chet was not looking at the store. He was looking down at something in his lap, maybe his phone. I waited there in that cold little room, shaking from more than just the temperature, watching that truck and praying he would not come inside looking for me. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The woman came to the door and told me she had called the sheriff, that someone was on the way even though it might take a while because of the roads. She asked if I wanted coffee, and I almost started crying at how kind she was being. I kept watching through that little window. Chet just sat there in his truck for what felt like forever. Engine still running, wipers still going. Then, after maybe 15 minutes, I saw the cab light come on. He was looking toward the store now, and even from that distance and through the snow, I could tell he was not happy. He sat there another minute or two, just staring at the building, and I stepped back from the window even though I knew he probably could not see me. Then the brake lights flashed. He put the truck in reverse and he pulled out of the lot. I watched those red taillights disappear into the white until I could not see them anymore. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on that old office chair. And that is when I finally let myself cry. The sheriff's deputy arrived about 40 minutes later, a younger guy named Whelan, who took my statement and drove me home himself. He told me they would look into it, try to find a truck matching that description. I gave him every detail I could remember: the camouflage hat, the gray beard, the fast food wrappers, the yellow rope, all of it. He nodded and wrote everything down, but I could tell from his face that he was not hopeful. A dark pickup truck in rural New York in winter. That could be half the county. They never found him, as far as I know. I called the sheriff's office a few times over the next month, but there were no leads, no similar reports, nothing. Sometimes I wonder if Chet was even his real name. I think about that night more than I should, especially when it snows. I think about what would have happened if that gas station had lost power like everywhere else, if there had been no lights to see through the trees. I think about where that road was taking me, and I know in my gut I was not meant to reach the end of it. The woman at the gas station, her name was Beverly, and I went back a week later to thank her properly. She told me I did the right thing trusting my instincts, that too many people ignore that voice in their head telling them something is wrong. I have not ignored it since. Snow had already begun piling against the porch steps by the time I pulled up to the cabin, and the whole place looked like it had been swallowed by winter. Work had me stretched thin that season, and taking a week away felt overdue, so the idea of a remote rental tucked behind a line of pines sounded perfect. The cabin sat about 20 minutes outside a small mountain town in Colorado, the kind with one main street and a diner that everyone swears is historic. I remember thinking the silence felt heavier than usual, like the snow had pressed the world into a quieter shape. While hauling my bags from the truck, I spotted the first set of footprints, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp, looping around the house in a weird, meandering path. My first thought was that maybe the owner had stopped by earlier, but the prints overlapped the snowfall from that morning, which didn't make much sense. The sight lingered with me as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin had that rented out too many times vibe, mismatched furniture and a faint smell of old firewood, but it felt warm enough. I set my stuff down, gave the place a quick look, and started noticing little details that nudged me in the ribs. A wooden chair sat a few feet away from the kitchen table, angled toward the window like someone had been watching the yard. A half-burned match rested near the rug, just sitting there as if whoever used it didn't care to clean up, and a couple of canned soups I'd seen listed in the inventory were missing from the pantry shelf. It wasn't dramatic, but it was just specific enough to make me second-guess the empty cabin vibe. I told myself someone must have sheltered here recently, happens all the time in these remote spots, and figured they moved on once the storm warnings rolled in. Still, the place didn't feel like it had been empty for long. The storm outside picked up speed fast, pushing snow against the windows until only faint shapes of the forest remained. With no cell signal and the nearest neighbor half a mile down the road, settling in felt like trying to relax inside a sealed box. I checked every room to calm my nerves. Everything was normal until I went upstairs and found the door at the end of the hall refusing to budge. It wasn't locked in the usual way. No keyhole, no latch, just wouldn't move, as if someone had shoved something heavy against it from the inside. I leaned my ear against the wood, heard nothing, and told myself the old frame had probably swollen from the cold. But that explanation didn't sit right. The door looked used recently, smudges on the paint, faint marks near the handle. It gave me a feeling I couldn't quite name, something that made me rethink spending the night there alone. As darkness settled, the storm swallowed whatever sound normally lived in the trees. I made a simple dinner, tried to distract myself with a book, and kept convincing my brain that the cabin was safe. The wind rattled the siding and whistled through gaps near the windows, and for a while, those noises explained everything. But close to midnight, just when I finally relaxed a little, a soft creak drifted down from upstairs. It wasn't the settling kind. The sound had weight, pacing, like someone shifting their balance on an old plank. I sat there staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each tiny groan of wood. Every few minutes, another one followed, faint and deliberate. The closed-off room, the footprints, the signs of someone eating and sitting here. It all tangled together in my head, and the cabin didn't feel remote anymore. It felt occupied. The next creak came while I was halfway through convincing myself it might be a tree branch brushing the siding. This one had a slow rise and fall to it, the kind of noise a floor makes when someone shifts their weight from one foot to the other. I moved closer to the bottom of the staircase, not because it felt like a good idea, but because sitting still made everything worse. The air on the second floor felt colder, like the warmth from the wood stove couldn't quite climb the steps. I stood there listening, trying to figure out if the sounds had a pattern. They didn't. It was as if whoever or whatever was up there moved only when I got close enough to hear it. I remember gripping the railing and feeling like the house was paying attention to me in a way buildings shouldn't. I ended up dragging one of the heavier chairs in front of the staircase, more for the illusion of control than anything practical. The storm outside didn't let up, and the windows trembled with every burst of wind, making the whole cabin feel restless. I kept thinking about the footprints circling the house, the way they drifted toward the tree line before disappearing entirely. Whoever made them hadn't just walked up, peeked inside, and left. They'd studied the place, circled it, maybe waited. I checked the front and back doors 3 separate times, pushing on them until I felt the frames bow slightly. Each round of checking made the silence between the creaks upstairs feel sharper, the kind of silence you don't want to disturb. Sometime after 1 in the morning, judging by the dim glow of the stove clock, I heard a thump directly above me. Not loud, just confident, like something had dropped onto the floor and rolled slightly before settling. I felt a pulse of adrenaline shoot through me, and I grabbed the nearest object with any weight to it, which happened to be a metal fireplace poker. It wasn't much, but holding it made me feel a little less helpless. I stood beneath that locked door, listening hard enough that my ears rang. No breathing, no shuffling, just the storm, and my own heartbeat pounding way too fast. I decided I couldn't sit around waiting for another noise. I had to see what was behind that door, even if it meant taking the frame apart. The toolbox the owner kept under the kitchen sink wasn't impressive, but it had a flathead screwdriver and a small hammer, enough to pry at the hinges. Going back upstairs felt like pushing into a colder atmosphere, as if the temperature shifted just to warn me off. I knelt beside the door, angled the screwdriver into the top hinge, and started working it loose. Each tap of the hammer echoed down the hallway, sounding way louder than it should have. After a few minutes of prying, I paused to wipe my forehead, and in that split second of stillness, another sound drifted from the other side of the door. Not a creak, not a thump. A soft exhale, steady and controlled, like someone trying to time their breathing with the noise of the storm. That quiet exhale rooted me in place. It wasn't startled or panicked. It felt measured, like someone who knew I was on the other side of the door and had been listening just as intently. I pressed my palm lightly against the wood, as if that could help me sense movement, but the door stayed completely still. The storm outside pounded harder, the wind dragging loose snow across the roof in long, scraping waves. I thought about retreating downstairs, barricading myself in the living room until morning, but the idea of turning my back on that door felt worse than facing whatever was behind it. I steadied my breath and went back to the hinge, chipping away at the metal until it finally gave with a muted snap. The lower hinge followed more easily. With both loose enough, I stood and braced myself to pull the door free. The moment I tugged on it, the wood shifted only a fraction before stopping abruptly, as though something heavy pressed against it from the inside. Not furniture, something softer, less rigid. I froze in that position, fingers curled around the edge of the door trying to figure out if I'd imagined the resistance. Then the weight pressed back, a slow, deliberate push that forced the gap closed again. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. The push didn't continue. Whoever, or whatever, had responded didn't try to break through, just reminded me that they were there. I stepped away from the frame, keeping my eyes locked on the slight slant of the door now hanging crooked on loosened hinges. The air in the hallway felt colder than the stairwell now, like something had seeped through the cracks. Backing down the stairs became a careful, shaky descent. I didn't take my eyes off the landing until I reached the bottom, and even then, I felt this odd pressure, like the upstairs wanted me back. I dragged the heavy chair again, wedging it under the doorknob as a makeshift barrier. The idea of sleeping became impossible, so I sat by the stove with the poker beside me, watching the faint glow reflect on the floorboards. Every so often, the cabin groaned or the wind slammed snow against the windows, and each time I expected footsteps to follow. Hours passed without another sound from upstairs, and the stillness didn't bring relief. Felt watchful, like the house had paused mid-breath waiting for me to react. I kept glancing toward the dark stairwell, half expecting a shadow to appear at the top. Around sunrise, the storm finally softened, leaving the world outside buried in fresh snow. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bags, threw everything into the truck, and kept the engine idling while I did one last sweep of the cabin from the doorway. The upstairs remained quiet, the crooked door unmoved. I stepped onto the porch, ready to leave this whole nightmare behind, when I noticed something that stopped me cold. A new set of footprints leading away from the house, heading straight into the thick trees behind the property. They were deep, clearer than the ones I'd seen the day before, and spaced like someone had been walking unhurriedly through the storm. No prints circled back, no tracks approached from any direction. Just a straight path leading into the forest, as if whoever shared the cabin with me had finally decided to leave at first light. I drove away without looking back. Snowstorms never used to bother me, at least not back when I worked late shifts and was used to driving through just about anything. That day, though, the sky had turned into this churning white wall that felt almost unreal, like someone had shaken a giant snow globe and forgotten to stop. I had just left a small office complex on the edge of town, where I'd been filling in for a coworker, and the wind was coming in sharp bursts that pushed against the side of my SUV hard enough to make it sway. By the time I reached the main road, I could barely make out the traffic lights through the swirling snow. Visibility dropped so fast it felt like the world beyond my windshield had simply dissolved, leaving me in this strange, muffled bubble of white noise. I figured the safest thing to do was pull into the first place I could, which happened to be a shopping center I'd been to a few times. Big lot, easy to navigate, usually empty during storms like that. The moment I rolled in, it felt like stepping into a void. The parking lot lights were on, but the storm was swallowing the glow before it reached the ground. I eased into a spot near the middle, turned on my hazards and let the engine idle so the heater could keep working. Snow was collecting fast on the hood, the flakes drifting sideways in long streaks as if they were being pulled by strings. Sitting there, I kept telling myself it would pass, that I'd wait 10 or 15 minutes, maybe call my sister to kill time. But the quiet was strange, too thick, too absolute, like the storm had created its own kind of silence that made every sound inside the car seem louder than it should have been. I rubbed the inside of the windshield to clear a small patch, trying to see if the outline of the road was any better from this angle. A few minutes passed before headlights appeared behind me. Vague at first through the heavy curtain of snow, they grew more defined, cutting slow arcs of light across the drifts, and then a dark sedan pulled into the lot. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone else was doing the same thing I was, waiting it out. But the car didn't park normally. It rolled in behind me and stopped at an angle that made my rear-view mirror fill entirely with its headlights. I could feel the brightness pressing against the back of my eyes even when I looked away. It wasn't close enough to tap my bumper, but near enough that I knew I couldn't back out. I waited for the driver to adjust, to pull into one of the dozens of empty spaces around us. But the sedan just stayed there, engine humming steadily, lights cutting perfectly through the storm. After a minute of that, unease started to crawl up my spine. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe the driver couldn't see well enough to pull into a spot, or maybe they were waiting for someone in one of the stores. I shifted into drive, planning to move to a different part of the lot, just to have some breathing room. As I rolled forward, the snow under my tires made that crunching sound that only deep drifts make, and I had to steer carefully to keep from sliding. I rounded the next lane and picked a spot near the far end where the lot met a row of dead shrubs. When I glanced in the mirror, I expected to see nothing but swirling white. Instead, the sedan was turning the corner, following my path with this slow, deliberate motion that made the hair on the back of my neck raise. It wasn't slipping, not even a little, while my SUV felt like it was skating on glass. I tried telling myself that maybe the driver had the same idea I did, that they were just trying to find a spot where the wind wasn't hammering the side of their car. But when I pulled into another row and angled myself toward the plowed center lane, the sedan adjusted in perfect sync, gliding behind me with this steady pace that felt intentional. The snow was thick enough that my headlights caught every flake in a frantic blur, yet the sedan's beams cut through the storm like nothing was touching them. I eased forward again, and the tires on my SUV slipped just enough to make the steering wheel shudder. The other car, though, moved with this unsettling precision. No fishtailing, no hesitation, as if the pavement beneath it wasn't buried under inches of ice. I shifted lanes abruptly, hoping to shake whatever this was, but the sedan mirrored my turn with a kind of slow persistence that made my mouth go dry. Trying not to panic, I looped around the lot toward the exit, but the snow was now blowing in such heavy sheets that the street beyond looked completely erased. The wind howled across the asphalt, lifting powder into swirling shapes that darted between the light poles like restless shadows. I knew that pulling onto the road blind would be a stupid risk, so I hesitated, inching forward just enough to test for traction. The sedan crept up behind me again, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I couldn't ignore the way it positioned itself. A quiet, steady push that felt more like herding than following. I backed away from the exit, hoping to buy myself a better angle, and the sedan drifted backward too, perfectly aligned with my movements. Something about that coordination made my whole body tighten with unease. I cut sharply into another lane, this time accelerating a bit harder than before, letting the back end slide until I corrected it. The sedan followed with the same agonizingly slow crawl, never speeding up, never struggling with the ice. The distance between us stayed exactly the same, like the driver was measuring it with invisible markers. The deeper I went into the lot, the less plowed the lanes became, and soon my tires were crunching through untouched snow that reached almost halfway up the bumper. The wind whipped the loose powder into spiraling waves, and my headlights caught the outlines of parking barriers buried beneath drifting mounds. Every turn felt like stepping deeper into a maze that someone else understood far better than I did. And still, the sedan advanced, patient and intentional. The moment I realized the driver wasn't just following me, but actually steering me somewhere hit me hard. Each time I tried to angle back toward the center of the lot, the sedan would shift just slightly, placing itself in a way that nudged me toward the outer edges, the places where the drifts were thickest and the plows hadn't touched. My tires began to sink into the softer snow, losing grip more quickly. I could feel the SUV laboring, the engine giving a low, strained groan as the wheels churned and slipped. The sedan maintained that same unnerving glide, always keeping itself clear of the deeper snow, always pushing me a bit farther from the safe, lit middle of the parking lot. There were no other cars, no silhouettes of people, just the storm and that dark shape behind me, using the white out like a curtain to hide whatever the driver had planned. I swung the wheel hard and tried cutting across 2 lanes at once, hoping momentum would carry me back toward the plowed section, but the snow grabbed at the tires like wet cement. The SUV lurched, then dragged sideways, and I had to feather the accelerator just to keep it from getting swallowed by the drift. Through the blur on my rear window, the sedan eased into view again, keeping the same deliberate pace as if nothing about the storm applied to it. The lights from the shopping center cast faint halos across the snow, but the sedan's shape absorbed most of it, turning into this low, steady outline that never faltered. Every time I tried adjusting, it answered with a quiet repositioning that cornered me a little more. The thought that this person wasn't improvising, that they had patience and a plan, settled heavily in my chest. I tried honking, hoping the noise would cut through the storm and maybe draw attention from someone inside one of the stores, even if they were closed. But the wind swallowed the sound almost instantly. I glanced toward the row of buildings, expecting at least a flicker of movement or a door opening, but nothing shifted. The storm had erased every sign of life. I shifted the SUV into reverse, trying to angle away from the deepest part of the lot, and the tires spun with a gritty whir before finally catching. As soon as I moved, the sedan drifted sideways in a wide arc, cutting off the only path that wasn't buried in snow. It didn't rush, didn't jerk forward, just eased into place with absolute control. It felt like the driver knew exactly how hard the storm was hitting me, and exactly how little it was affecting them. A surge of frustration mixed with fear, and I pressed the accelerator harder than I meant to. The SUV jerked forward, bouncing slightly as the front wheels rolled over a mound of packed snow. I aimed toward a narrow corridor between 2 long banks, thinking the sedan wouldn't risk getting stuck there. The wind pushed against the side of the SUV, and for a moment all I could see were streaks of white slashing across the windshield. When the snow thinned enough to reveal the lot again, the sedan was already repositioning, slowly pivoting as if anticipating my route. Its headlights swept across the drifts but never wavered. I kept expecting to see a slip, a skid, anything that proved the driver was dealing with the same conditions I was. But the sedan moved almost like it had its own traction, its own rules, its own quiet confidence in the storm. As I neared the narrow corridor, the snow piled higher than I'd realized, reaching nearly to the grill. I knew if I went any farther, the SUV might bottom out, and then I'd be truly stuck with nowhere to go. The sedan crept closer, not speeding up but tightening the distance in a way that drained the little room I had left. The air in the car felt heavy, like it was pressing inward with the same density as the storm outside. I kept scanning for an opening, a break in the drifts, a clearer path, anything. But the sedan angled itself to cut off every option. It wasn't chasing anymore, it was corralling, positioning, closing the circle one careful adjustment at a time. And the terrifying part wasn't the storm or the isolation. It was realizing that whoever was inside that car had chosen me, specifically, and wasn't waiting for visibility to improve. They were waiting for me to run out of space. I stopped trying to outmaneuver the sedan, and focused instead on keeping the engine running. The wind buffeted the SUV so hard it made the windows tremble, and snow piled against the doors like it was trying to bury me in place. The sedan crept closer until its headlights filled the back window again, bright enough to wash the interior in a pale glow. I could see the shape of the driver only as a dark silhouette, sitting unnervingly still. No gestures, no attempts to communicate. Just that unmoving outline watching through the glass. My pulse hammered as I realized the storm had given them exactly what they needed. An empty lot, zero visibility, and a single target with nowhere reliable to go. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and tried to steady my breathing, knowing that panicking would only cloud whatever chance I still had. The idea came to me suddenly, irrational, desperate, but the only thing that offered even a sliver of hope. If I could reverse straight toward the sedan, not to hit it but to force it to shift position, maybe I could create just enough space to swing around and get back to the plowed section. It felt reckless, but so did staying put. I shifted into reverse and gave the SUV a sharp tap of gas. The wheels spun, then caught, and the SUV slid backward a few feet before the sedan reacted. It drifted back smoothly, still refusing to skid or jerk, but the movement was enough. That small gap opened, barely wider than the SUV itself. I threw the car into drive and swung the wheel hard, the tires groaning as they mashed deep snow. The front end kicked sideways, then straightened as the SUV lunged toward the center of the lot. I didn't look behind me. The storm had thickened again, turning everything into a white curtain broken only by faint silhouettes of light poles. I aimed for the faintest strip of darker pavement, the one path that looked even remotely cleared. The SUV bucked once as it rolled over uneven snow, then steadied as the tires found better traction. I pushed forward, inch by inch, expecting at any moment to see headlights slicing through the storm behind me. But the glow didn't reappear. Even when I reached the plowed area, I couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction, just swirling white swallowing everything. I took the chance anyway, steering toward the exit and creeping onto the road. The wind was fierce, but the pavement underneath felt more solid than anything in the lot. Once I made it onto the main street, I kept going until my knuckles ached from how tight I was holding the wheel. I drove slowly, hugging the edge and watching for any sign of that sedan, but nothing emerged from the storm. Not a single pair of headlights appeared in my mirrors. When I finally reached a gas station with lights bright enough to cut through the haze, I pulled in and parked under the canopy. I stayed there until the storm eased up, long after the SUV's heater had dried my coat and melted the snow on my boots. No one else ever pulled into the lot behind me. To this day, I don't know if the sedan stayed in that shopping center or vanished the moment I left, but I never forgot how deliberately it moved, how silently it closed in, and how the storm felt less like weather and more like someone's cover for something I was never meant to understand. Growing up in a small town where storms shut everything down, quiet nights were pretty normal for me. That winter, I was 17, and spending the day stuck at home because the roads had already turned into thick white tunnels by mid-afternoon. My mom was working an overnight shift at a clinic 2 towns away, and my older brother was visiting friends out of state, so I had the house to myself. I planned to ride out the storm watching movies and reheating leftovers. Nothing more ambitious than that. The wind kept rattling the siding in these long, uneven bursts that made the whole place feel older than it really was. I remember checking the weather app every hour, mostly out of habit, watching the alerts pile up like warnings I didn't think I needed to take seriously. For most of the evening, the storm felt like the biggest thing I'd have to deal with. The knocking started sometime after the sun disappeared behind a wall of snow. It wasn't a quick tap or something you'd blame on a loose branch. It came in firm, spaced-out beats, like the person wanted to make sure I heard every single one. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor needed help, even though nobody ever walks around during one of our blizzards unless something's truly wrong. When I peeked through the side window next to the door, a man stood on the porch wearing a food delivery jacket, bright red with a reflective stripe across the chest, the kind you'd notice even in bad weather. He held a takeout bag that sagged on one side, like whatever was inside had shifted too many times. He wasn't shivering, even though the wind was blowing straight at him. When he saw me behind the curtain, he lifted the bag a little and tilted his head, waiting. He called out that he had a delivery for the emergency order placed from this address. His voice carried oddly well through the storm, as if the wind pushed it right up against the glass. I told him I hadn't ordered anything and that no restaurants were running deliveries because of the road closures. He didn't argue. He just said the order came from inside my house, like he was repeating a line someone had coached him to say. The way he stood didn't match the cold at all. He kept his shoulders relaxed, one hand in his pocket like he was waiting at a bus stop instead of standing knee-deep in snow. Something about that calmness in weather that brutal made the air in the room feel heavier. I told him again through the door that he had the wrong place. He didn't move. He didn't respond. He just lowered the bag slowly, as if testing my reaction. Then he stepped off the porch. For a second, I thought he was leaving, but he veered toward the side of the house instead of heading back down the driveway. His boots pressed deep into the untouched snow, leaving sharp impressions that the wind hadn't had time to cover. I heard the crunching get closer to the living room windows, and the shape of his jacket brushed past the edge of the blinds. He didn't knock anymore. He just circled, pausing at each window like he was checking for weak points. I turned off every light I could reach, hoping darkness would make him go away, but the sound of his steps kept drifting from one side of the house to the other. At one point, something tapped lightly against the kitchen window, not loud enough to break anything, but deliberate enough that I knew exactly who it was. The storm outside felt easier to handle than whatever was walking around my house. For a long stretch, the only thing I could hear was the wind pushing against the walls and the faint scrape of his boots shifting positions. I stayed crouched near the hallway, where I could see parts of the house without being visible from any window. My phone kept losing signal, so every attempt to call my mom or the non-emergency line ended in a frozen screen or a dropped connection. The outage made the house unnervingly quiet between gusts, the kind of silence where every small noise snaps into focus. At one point, I thought he had finally left because the footsteps stopped completely. I waited a full 10 minutes before poking my head toward the living room window. That's when I noticed a shadow near the far corner of the porch, still as a statue. I couldn't make out his face, but the reflective stripe across his jacket caught a bit of light from my neighbor's generator, just enough to show he was still out there. The storm kept intensifying, which made his persistence even stranger. No normal delivery driver or anyone with common sense would have stayed outside in weather like that unless something was seriously wrong. Every so often he'd test another window, never forcefully, just these soft, methodical taps or a brief rattle of the frame. It felt like he was studying the house more than trying to get my attention. I remember gripping the edge of the wall so hard my fingers went numb, trying to listen past the sound of my own breathing. I didn't dare move to another room. It felt like shifting around might somehow encourage him. When the tapping reached the dining room window, I heard him mutter something too low to understand, like he was repeating directions to himself. Eventually, I managed to get a single text out to the sheriff's office. Nothing fancy, just my address and the fact that someone was trying to get inside. I never got a confirmation that it sent, but it was the only thing I could think to do. Minutes after that, the sounds outside changed. Instead of tapping or footsteps, there was this dragging noise along the outer wall, almost like he was brushing the takeout bag along the siding. When it reached the back door, something nudged the metal just hard enough to shake it in the frame. That door had always been sturdy, but hearing it shift even a little made my chest tighten in a way I still remember clearly. I sat there with my knees pulled in, watching the shadows move across the kitchen floor whenever the wind changed direction. What scared me most was how patient he seemed. He never shouted, never banged, never acted like someone frustrated by being ignored. It felt like he had all night to wait me out. The blizzard kept covering his earlier tracks, but every time he circled the property, he carved a new path into the snow. I stopped trying to follow his movements and just waited, hoping that help was actually on the way. After what felt like hours, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. Slow, heavy, the kind of sound that didn't belong to a normal car. The noise made him pause. I could tell by the sudden stillness outside the kitchen window. For the first time since he arrived, he stepped back, retreating toward the edge of the yard. I didn't move until the engine grew loud enough to shake the floorboards. 2 deputies showed up in a patrol truck outfitted for heavy snow, their headlights cutting long, pale arcs across the yard. When they got out, the man in the delivery jacket didn't run, not right away. He lingered near the tree line as if weighing his options, the takeout bag still hanging loosely from his hand. One of the deputies called out to him, and instead of answering, he turned and disappeared into the whiteout so smoothly, it looked like the storm swallowed him whole. They didn't bother chasing him. Visibility was too poor, and they were more focused on checking the house and making sure I was all right. When I opened the door for them, the blast of cold air felt almost unreal after so many hours of being trapped in that dim, silent house. They walked the perimeter while I waited just inside the entryway, watching their flashlights sweep across the snow. The storm had buried most of the earlier footprints, but a few deeper impressions showed where he'd circled over and over again. The deputies noticed something else too. Prints leading up to windows I hadn't even realized he checked, including the small basement one I always forget exists. The delivery jacket bothered them immediately because they knew every restaurant for miles had shut down before the roads became impassable. One of them asked if he'd given a name or mentioned any kind of mix-up, but the only thing he ever claimed was that someone inside placed an emergency order. Hearing that phrase repeated by someone else made it sound even stranger than when he'd said it himself. They stayed with me until the storm eased enough for their dispatcher to confirm other reports. Apparently a man wearing various delivery jackets, different colors, different brands, had tried approaching several houses that night. In some of those cases, homeowners heard him trying door handles or sliding something along the window frames. Nobody had opened their doors either, mostly because nobody was expecting food in the middle of a blizzard. The deputies suspected he'd been targeting places where cars were gone or lights were low, hoping someone might panic and let him inside. Knowing it wasn't just me he approached made the whole situation feel bigger than a random misunderstanding, like he'd planned a route through the storm. By morning, the snow had settled, and the world outside looked clean and untouched, as if nothing had happened. But their tire tracks and the faint remains of his footprints were enough to remind me otherwise. The sheriff's office never caught him, at least not that I ever heard. Still, after that night my mom replaced every lock, added motion lights, and had me keep the house phone plugged in at all times. The deputies told us I'd done the right thing by refusing to open the door, especially with someone impersonating multiple delivery services. Even now, whenever a winter storm rolls in, I can't help glancing at the windows more than I need to, listening for sounds I hope I never hear again. Nothing like that has happened since, but the memory of that man calmly circling our house will probably stay with me for the rest of my life.